Rain came down like the world was trying to remember how to cry. Sheets of it hammered the diner windows, blurring neon into watercolor streaks. Inside, the lunch counter hummed with the steady clink of spoons and the small conversations that keep strangers from feeling like strangers. A bell over the door chimed, and a man stepped in, soaked to the bone, holding the hand of a little boy whose hair dripped into his collar. He looked like someone who'd learned how to carry dignity even when the world had nothing to return it with. "Can we stay until the rain stops?" the man asked, his voice low and plain. There was no tremor of begging in it, only a question folded into a tired, polite tone, as if his manners were the last thing he could call his own. The room grew a few degrees quieter. The child, barely 6, with a laugh that arrived like a bell even when he was cold, looked up and offered a shy "please?" His shoes left a dark trace across the linoleum. Not far from the doorway, in a booth near the fogged-up window, a man watched everything. He sat alone, wrapped in a coat that cost more than the diner did, a paper cup of coffee untouched at his elbow. Rain streaked his reflection, distorted the cut of his face. He saw the man and the child cross the diner, and he noticed the way the father folded his coat over the boy's shoulders. He noticed how, for a second, the father looked at the empty chair across from him, an old habit of measuring the world by the spaces people used to take up. Elliot Sterling did not move right away. He had been practicing stillness for months. Stillness in the mornings when he called his wife's number out of habit, stillness at meals when an extra plate remained unused, stillness in boardrooms where the echo of his own voice no longer comforted him. The chair at his own kitchen table sat, like a bruise, a reminder. He had seen grief in many forms, newsprint, condolence notes, the quiet of other people's houses, but tonight the grief in that wrapped overcoat read like his own. He watched the man's jaw tighten as if against a name. He watched the boy tuck his cold hands into the man's palm. Elliot began to feel the ache that had been secretly naming itself in him for months. At the counter, the short-order cook, Maggie, caught the man's eyes and patted the stool next to her. "Coming right up," she said, without the questions that made pride feel smaller. Another regular, Jack Rowan, who spent early mornings fixing the town's cars and late nights eating at this exact counter, looked up from his coffee. He was a broad-shouldered man with grease at the edges of his fingernails and an empty chair in his own kitchen at home. He had brought his daughter Leela to the counter once when she was small, the same way the father holds the boy now. He knew the hunger in other people's hands. He pushed his chipped mug forward. "Have a seat," he said. It wasn't charity, it was how the world was supposed to work.
The man accepted the seat across from the boy, and Maggie put a bowl of soup in front of him like a small, hot decree of sanctuary. The steam rose and fogged the man's spectacles. The boy inhaled and said thank you, the way children do, without calculation, with full lungs. Someone wiped the boy's hair with a napkin, without making it a big thing. The diner returned to its rhythm. Elliot watched until the memory of his wife's laugh, Sarah's laugh, rose like a tide and threatened to pull him under. He looked away, pressed his fingertips to the photo on his phone. Sarah in a nurse's scrubs, hair tucked back, laughing at something off camera. She had been the kind of person who would have given away the last bun on purpose just to see someone smile. She had taught Elliot the language of small kindnesses, though he had spent much of his life answering with balance sheets instead of plates. After she was gone, the house filled with the shape of her absence. He told himself he would not become the sort of man who only regretted his softness in private. He left without drama. No one saw him stand, pull his coat around him, and step back into the rain. From the sidewalk, he watched the diner's neon, homey, stubborn, until the man and the boy left and the bell chimed their exit. He saw them cross the street and disappear into the blur. He could have walked on. He could have gone home and left his hands empty. Instead, he sat for a long time with his coffee cooling and thought about empty chairs. If this story is touching you right now, share it with someone who needs to remember that a single question can change everything. That night, Elliot did not drive home. He drove slowly, as if the map in him had changed to include the measure of a small boy's hand. He passed the rundown shelter that closed its doors at midnight, and a row of streetlights that flickered like the eyes of people still awake. In the quiet of his car, he made a list, not a full plan, but a series of yeses and nos. He would not become a rescuer who promised miracles. He would not believe that one night could fix a life. But he could be a resource, a hinge. He could be the thing that opened a door. The man and the boy, Daniel and Ethan, were more than a rainy night tableau. Daniel was a father who had been sleeping in the doorway of a parish house after losing his job when the factory closed, and a landlord decided he could not pay the rent without an income. He carried his past in careful, modest pieces: a folded letter from a former employer, a necklace of keys that had been the last remnants of what he thought of as stability. He had not wanted pity, he had wanted shelter until the storm eased, a kindness that kept the boy warm for a while. Elliot hired someone to look into where Daniel had been sleeping, bought him a weatherproof coat, and paid for a night's stay at a small rooming house with a real lock.
He did not announce it because he did not want to make the man feel like an exhibit. He gave quietly, as he had learned from Sarah, who had always preferred to do good with a gentle hand. But Elliot's first move was only the beginning. He could hand someone cash. He could not hand them trust. The real work had to be done in the space between gestures, the weeks when habits change, the months when a routine becomes a rhythm. For that, Daniel needed community. He needed work. He needed a place to lay his head that was more than temporary. He needed people who looked him in the eye and said, "I see you." Jack already had a foot in that work. He knew Marcus, who owned the bakery 2 blocks over, a small shop that opened at dawn and smelled like butter and second chances. Marcus had taken in apprentices who could measure flour with careful palms. He had a slow, sure way of teaching. Marcus had once been helped too, and he ran his business on the principle that people were not problems, but partners. It was Jack who introduced Daniel to Marcus. The bakery had a backroom office with a crooked calendar and a pot of coffee that tasted like forgiveness. Marcus listened to Daniel's short accounting of what he could do. Early mornings, late nights, the reliability that comes from a man who does what's needed because there's a child waiting. Marcus asked him to start with an early shift, sweeping ovens and learning how to tell when dough was right by feel. Daniel arrived every morning with a thermos of tepid coffee and an intensity that was almost fierce. He rose with the ovens, his hands reddening from heat and dough. He learned quickly, not because he wanted to escape, but because he wanted to give Ethan a chance at a life that included steady meals and a bed that belonged to them. Weeks became months. Tuesday nights at the diner, because Maggie loved a Tuesday special, and because Jack liked to get soup on Tuesdays, became their ritual. At the counter, Jack would save a plate. Elliot, who sometimes came to town on business, began to drop by more often. He would sit back and watch, sometimes leaning forward to ask a small, practical question. Did Daniel need childcare for a few hours while he took the pastry exam? How did the bakery feel about hiring another person full-time? The questions were not thunderbolts, they were keys. There were setbacks, little ones, and some that felt large at the time. People in the neighborhood whispered. A woman at the PTA meeting looked at Daniel and saw shadows she had been taught to fear. Who vouched for him? She asked. Jack, who had a humble fury when it came to his community's wounded, spoke up plainly about hands and plates and how kindness looked when practiced. Marcus pointed out Daniel's presence in the early mornings, his punctuality like gospel. The PTA softened, then shifted, the gossip dissolving into curiosity. Not everything smoothed at once. Once, a small theft in the bakery, only a box of chocolate chips, sent a ripple of suspicion. Daniel volunteered to take on extra shifts to help cover the loss, and when the real culprit, a teenager ashamed and scared, came in to confess, Daniel sat with him and told him how shame could be met with work, not exile. He taught the boy how to roll a perfect cinnamon twist and offered him a job if he came back steady. The bakery became a place where mistakes were met with a hand to help up, rather than a finger to point out the fall. As Daniel's income rose, he moved from the rooming house to a modest studio with real light and a window that looked onto a street tree. Elliot arranged for a local landlord to accept a small, steady deposit instead of an upfront sum. That afternoon, when Daniel found the keys tucked under a magnet and the apartment's tiny welcome mat in place, he sat on the floor and cried quietly. No spectacle, just the sound of a man whose prayers had been practical and who now could rest from the ache of never being sure where he would sleep. Ethan learned to watch the ovens with the reverence of a child discovering a miracle. He would press his face to the bakery window and say, "We did it, Daddy," in the language of children who know success with a completeness adults often elide. He became a small but persistent presence in the bakery, handing napkins to customers and, on fortunate afternoons, folding baguettes with the same meticulousness as his father. Elliot did not tell the town that he was paying for the down payment on the apartment or the bakery equipment upgrade Marcus needed. He never sat at a press conference or asked for a plaque. Instead, when the bakery began to do well enough to consider an expansion, a plain envelope appeared in Marcus's office with enough to buy a proper mixer. Marcus left a note kin to the register. For hands that rise early, and for the boy who laughs like he has everything. The note was unsigned. There were other quiet interventions. Elliot paid for a part-time after-school program for Ethan, so Daniel could work late shifts when needed. He brought over books to the studio apartment and put a framed photograph of his own wife on the wall of the bakery backroom, not to memorialize himself, but to create a habit of remembering someone who once insisted that nobody eat alone. People began to whisper that the bakery had a certain grace, an invisible generosity that warmed the bread before customers touched it. Months taught them patience. Daniel learned how to balance bills and pride. He took a course in accounting at night, the kind that taught the difference between profit and virtue, but also insisted that the two could coexist. He learned to answer questions about his past without letting it define him. He learned to accept help that was not charity, but partnership. He began to save a little, enough to look at Ethan and say, "We're building something."
Sweet Grace Bakery, so named for no single person at first, a name that stuck because a customer once said, "There's grace in the way these muffins keep company," became a small hub. It was not a miracle factory. Customers still came and left, bills still came in, ovens still broke on bad mornings. But the bakery had a rhythm that was generous in the way it insisted on ordinary kindnesses. They started hosting a simple Tuesday table after hours, a free meal for those who needed it, prepared by staff volunteers and paid for by a small envelope that arrived from a donor who believes in second chances. At one of those tables, the man who had once been too proud to accept a hand now stood to make a short speech. He had learned to speak in public without theatrics. "This started because one person pulled a chair out for two cooled people on a windy night," he said, voice steady. "Someone saw us. Someone kept seeing us. Now we sit together. We feed each other. We pay it forward the only way we know how, one plate at a time." The room listened. Elliot sat in the corner, watching, not because he wanted credit, but because it was the first time in a long while he had felt like a witness to something that mattered more than any ledger. He caught a glimpse of Sarah's laugh in a child's mouth at the next table, and felt for the first time in months that his loss had not been wasted. Not everyone approved. A few neighbors rolled their eyes at the charity dinners. A local columnist wrote that the town was turning its back on hard truths by handing out free meals. But the people who ate at the bakery's Tuesday table, those who had been cooled by a world that often forgot their names, kept showing up. They washed dishes, they brought desserts, they volunteered to clean the sidewalk. Dignity was not a thing you received and kept. It was a muscle you exercised in community. One winter evening, a year and a month from the night the rain had blurred the diner's window, the bakery hosted a community meal that nearly filled every chair. Snow drifted soft outside. Lila, Jack's daughter, now tall enough to help arrange the centerpieces, stacked plates with a careful hand. Marcus carved the turkey with a smile that had found its way back into his face. Children ran between tables with paper crowns. Someone had strung lights across the ceiling so that the small room looked for a night like a conservatory of warmth. Elliot stood near the doorway, listening. He looked at Daniel, who had a steady line of flour dust on his cheek like a war stripe earned in battalions of kindness. Daniel had his arm around Ethan, who wore a little sweater knit by Mrs. Patterson from the neighborhood church. Jack, who had found in fixing cars and bringing soup a practical theology of presence, stood in the center like a fulcrum. There was a framed photograph on the bakery wall. Sarah, laughing with an apron on, flour on her hands, a tray balanced in front of her. When the room quieted, Daniel stood. He paused, then spoke with the same plainness that had been his language from the beginning. "We all have empty chairs," he said. "Some of them are there because of loss, some because of bad luck. The thing that happened to me and my son could have been just that, something that happens. But somebody sat with us, somebody saw us. That seeing turned into a table." He walked to the photograph and touched the frame as if it were a bridge. "This began because of a woman who gave a seat to a stranger," he said, voice catching. "We call this place Sweet Grace because grace is what kept coming. And tonight we sit, we eat, we remember that we are part of one another." A murmur like wind in trees moved through the room. Someone laughed, someone cried softly, someone at the back nodded as if in prayer. Elliot felt the old familiar weight of gratitude rise. He had wanted to move someone with his checkbook. Instead, what moved him was watching people move each other with small, steady acts. There were quieter things too that mattered. Leela had learned to tie cupcake boxes with neat, cheerful bows. Mrs. Kim from the corner shop volunteered to bring extra vegetables each month. The bakery started a weekly baking class for kids, taught by Daniel, who found delight in the way young hands transformed dough into possibility. He taught them patience and how heat could change simple ingredients into something nourishing. The class was called Need to Know, and children came home smelling like butter and goodness, telling their parents that they had made something meant to be shared. Elliot never grandstanded. He refused an interview request that wanted to know the mystery donor's identity. But when the town asked who had helped to buy the mixer or to fund the Tuesday table, Marcus would say it was a neighbor, and that was true. The neighbor was Elliot, and Elliot was also a man who wanted to be ordinary in his generosity. He liked being the sort of person whose help took the form of a phone call, a check, a loan, a quiet message that said, "Keep going." By the time the bakery sign was repainted and its window displayed a small plaque thanking the community for its support, Sweet Grace had become more than commerce. It had become a small social contract. Come hungry, leave invited. It was the kind of place where a stranger could sit and not be a stranger for long. The ripple extended. A former neighbor of Daniel's who had once judged him came to the bakery and offered to mentor another man who had been in and out of shelters. The teenager who had stolen the chocolate chips worked his way into a steady shift and later brought his siblings on Saturdays to learn the trade. Jack, who fixed cars, began to offer a change a flat and talk morning where he gave discounted repairs to single parents in exchange for stories about what they needed.
The point was not that one man solved the world's problems. It was that a community began to remember how everything held together when small pieces fit. The toughest thing to watch through all of it was when the town's caution surfaced as criticism. "They're playing charity," someone wrote, meaning they thought the Tuesday table was a show. Another person said the bakery should stay the bakery and not get involved in social work. During these moments, Daniel felt a flash of that old defensive pride. He would, if he could, explain himself so others could not use his story as a lesson. Instead, he chose to carry on. He invited the greatest skeptics to a meal. The skeptics ate. They saw hands that were steady. The skeptics began to measure things less by suspicion and more by time spent and plates cleared. It was a slow conversion. On a late afternoon, Elliot dropped by the bakery and found Daniel arranging a small display of cupcakes with such care it looked like arranging small flags. "You look like a man who was born to do this," Elliot said without preamble. Daniel smiled, a little surprised by the compliment. "I was born to keep a boy fed," he said. This is just how we make that happen." Elliot nodded. "You don't let anyone take your dignity." "Nobody's taken it," Daniel said. "I give it away sometimes, but I do it on my own terms." It was the kind of answer that made Elliot think of Sarah teaching him about giving without performance. Elliot's grief had taught him to listen when people asserted their agency. He liked Daniel for the same reason he liked his wife. She saw people as partners rather than projects. One spring, the restaurant columnist who had once criticized the Tuesday table wrote a brief retraction. He had visited in secret and found a community where people cooked and laughed and argued and cleaned. He had met a man named Daniel who taught him how to roll dough. He had eaten a loaf of bread that tasted like a place where ordinary people practiced being human. The columnist wrote, "This town has a kitchen that remembers the hungry. That's an answer I didn't expect." You could say the bakeries and dinners were a bandage on a larger wound. That was true. But a bandage that becomes a place to gather can be a beginning. People moved into other jobs, enrolled in classes, found ways to connect that were not dependent on one donor. When a funding crisis threatened the Tuesday table one winter, Elliot organized a small local fundraiser. Not a gala, but a community bake sale, and the people responded. They came with pies and casseroles, with stories and cash, with a willingness to be seen. In the end, the fundraiser raised only enough to keep the table going that season, but it also taught the town how to care without waiting for a hero. On the anniversary of the night the rain had forced two people into a diner, the bakery hosted a simple memorial.
They set an empty chair at the center of the room and placed a single plate on it, a reminder of all the seats that could be filled. Daniel said a short blessing. No dogma, only gratitude. People spoke about Sarah, about how one person's insistence on hospitality could multiply. Leela read from a journal she had found among her mother's things at home. It had been Sarah's habit to jot little reminders. Call Mrs. Kim. Bring an extra loaf tomorrow. Remember to let people take their time. The tiny act of remembering became a manual of living. Elliot, who had been standing in the back, felt a peculiar kind of reconciliation. He had come to help in a practical way, to make sure a man had keys and a child had a bed. What he had received in return was less measurable, but deeper. He had been given a place to see himself in the mirror of other people's lives. The empty chair in his kitchen still existed, but it no longer felt like a void that devoured him. It had become, in a way, a door. There was a moment at the end of the night when the snow turned the street outside into a hush. People lingered, reluctant to step back into the cold. Daniel and Ethan walked home together under a borrowed umbrella that someone had left at the bakery the week before. Jack walked a few steps with them, talking about a leak in Daniel's roof he could fix for little more than the cost of a bag of nails. Marcus shut down the ovens. Unopened jars cooled on the counter. The light inside burned like a promise. As Daniel reached for the keys to his studio, Ethan tugged at his sleeve and said, "Daddy, can we invite Mr. Sterling to our table next Tuesday?" Daniel smiled, surprised and touched by the child's earnestness. "We can invite anyone," he replied. "But remember, Mr. Sterling doesn't need to be invited. He already comes. He likes to sit and listen." Elliot, who happened to be closing his briefcase at that very moment on the sidewalk, looked up and met their eyes. The exchange was small and human. He realized as he walked away that the most important thing he had done was not the check he had written. It was the fact that he had seen them when they needed to be seen. Years later, when Sweet Grace Bakery had expanded to a second, slightly larger location, and when Tuesday nights were a staple in 3 different neighborhoods, children who had eaten there as toddlers sat behind the counter and taught new volunteers how to roll dough. The bakery never became a cure-all. People still fell on hard times, recipes still failed, ovens still conked out. But there was now a system in place, less glamorous than headlines, but more sustainable than loans, that connected people who had once been strangers into something practical and warm. Once, at a bakery anniversary event, someone asked Elliot why he had stopped at that diner that rainy night, and why he had kept seeing the people who passed through the bakery. He answered simply, "Because it was what Sarah would have done."
And because I learned that the human thing to do is to look up from your own plate and make room for another. Daniel, who had been listening, added, "And because it matters to be known." No one said it was easy. There were arguments about who should be hired first, debates about how to divide donations fairly, nights when the funds were thin and no one knew which bill would be late. The story was honest about the friction. That honesty was what convinced people to stay. They were invited to be flawed helpers, not celebrities of charity. On the last clear night before the anniversary of the first rainy evening, Elliot walked into the bakery and took the corner booth as if by habit. He looked out at the town that had taught him how to grieve with hands that reached forward. He thought of the phrase the community had adopted, Sarah's table, an informal name that had stuck because of the woman who once insisted that no one should eat alone. He thought of the child who had said, "Please," in a voice like a bell. He thought of the father who had asked to stay until the rain stopped, and of the way that single question had started a chain. Outside, snow began again, soft as promises. Inside, people filled chairs that had once been empty. A candle flickered on each table. Elliot tucked his hands into his coat and smiled, small and private. He had seen everything that night at the diner. He had seen hands reach, eyes meet, pride held steady. He had seen the beginning of a house made of human kindness. What he had not seen at first was how being present would chase the hollow out of his own heart. The final image lingered, a long table, full of plates and laughter, someone sliding an extra chair into place without a question. The rain stopped somewhere outside the town's borders, and for a little while, the world measured itself in full chairs instead of absences. If this story moved you, consider sharing it with someone who needs hope, and if you believe no one should have to eat alone, subscribe and be part of the small work of keeping chairs ready for those who come in from the rain.